Alright, it's gonna revisit Kapila's philosophy of materialism and nature. And this is his basic meditation and inquiry into the origin of this self-creation. So, Kapila's primary principle is that the world is material. Matter, Prakriti, is the basis of everything that is. It is omnipresent, eternal, and one. Now, again, when he says matter in the form of Prakriti or Prakrti, he's talking about the all-pervading material substratum, not necessarily matter as we experience it in sensible form. He's referring to a finer substance that is beyond senses. The motion of Prakriti is just as eternal as Prakriti itself. Primordially, Prakriti has no outside cause. For matter, Prakriti has neither beginning nor end. Kapila wrote that the world was not created and therefore there was no creator. So that's the key premise. In order for there to be a creator, there has to be a first cause. He's saying that the material substratum is eternal, therefore it wasn't caused, therefore it wasn't created. You could say it's a self-creation. That's different from saying created. The world itself was the cause of the world. The world developed gradually. Kapila recognized the objective nature of the cause and effect links in nature. Self-development of nature from the lower forms to the higher. The first sloka of the Samkhya Karika says that there is continuity in the development of the world from the lower to the higher. Nothing can arise out of something that does not exist. There is a close tie between cause and effect. If that were not so, everywhere, at any moment, anything at all could arise. Each cause conditions a specific effect, and there can be no cause without an effect. The effect is always inseparable from the cause. Therefore, any existence is conditioned. So he's laying out his premise on cause and effect. He's saying if we see the effect of the world, this effect must be inherent within the cause, which is the material substratum. Now, he doesn't reject atomism, but he tries to go even deeper than atomism. Beyond the atoms, what is the all-pervading substance that they emerge within? He's calling it nature. He even calls it Pradhan also. So, Kapila used the materialist doctrine of the cause and effect links to substantiate his atheism and to criticize the religion of Brahmanism. He wrote that if the first cause is God, Brahma, and the world is the effect, there is a discrepancy between cause and effect. There can be, however, no discrepancy between cause and effect. The cause of the world is matter, Prakriti, the all-pervading material substratum. The universe is the result of modifications of matter. Now, this was written by actually a Russian endonologist, and of course this is a very intelligent breakdown, but of course he believed in the universe as space, vacuum. But I'll just say the world, or I'll say the world system, or world sphere that we inhabit when they say the universe. So, but it's basically the result of modifications of matter. And he also says how the first cause cannot be Brahma because the effect is not Brahma-like. And that goes back into what I was saying about the sort of a Gnostic premise where, well, if you're saying that God, Brahma, is perfect, all intelligent, supreme, all these excellent qualities, well, why don't we see this in the world? But there's an even deeper take on that, which I'll probably address in another video. So, as we see, Kapila uses the category of causality from the very start in the exposition of his philosophical views. This is not accidental. The point is that the positions of Samkhya on causality were the decisive premise which determined his philosophical orientation. In criticizing Marxism, Lenin pointed out the question of causality is particularly important in determining the philosophical line of any of the recent isms. As we see it, this idea of Lenin's is entirely valid, methodologically, relative to some of the oldest isms. Basically, they're stressing the importance of causality because, what's the first cause? That's the origin of religion. When people say, what's the cause of the world? They'll just say God. Now, you can come back around to saying that, but these guys want to first go through a rational approach of breaking everything down using human intelligence first, before jumping on the fanatic bandwagon of just worshiping the simple premise or the simple notion of God. But But this causality is the key point of Kapila's philosophy of materialism. According to the Samkhya doctrine, everything, any phenomenon, has its material cause. All relations between cause and effect are conceived in the sense that the latter is always present in the former. So, here's the key. He'll say that the cause has to be in the effect. The effect must only be a demonstration of the cause. Now, to counter this, what would be pointed out here, and he makes a note about this, he wants to point out, as a side note to this, let us point out that the Buddhists, Naiyayiks, and Vaisheshikas adhere to another view of this question. They believe that the effect does not actually exist in the material cause. Their argument is that if the effect existed in the material cause, there would be no need for the efficient cause. If, for instance, the pot actually exists in the clay, what is the potter for? The theory that the effect does not exist in the material cause before it is produced is sometimes called Arambhavada. That is the theory of the origin of the new in the effect. So they'll say, like the Vaisheshikas and Naiyayiks and the Buddhists would say, not exactly, it's like the cake thing. It's like, well, the eggs, the sugar, the flour, the cocoa powder, that's not cake yet. So we don't find cake in eggs, we don't find cake in sugar, we don't find cake in cocoa powder. We mix them together, we have a new effect from the causes, which the cake did not originate in itself. But Kapila didn't agree. So the following are the Samkhya arguments in favor of his position. There are two kinds of causes: material, in which the effect is latent, and efficient or productive, which helps the effect to manifest itself. If we accept, however, that the material cause does not contain the effect, the concept of productive cause loses its meaning, for it has no object of action. So he's holding to the case that, well, no, there must be these causes, they must contain the effect inherent within them. They must contain the effect inherent within them. So assuming that an effect arises out of a cause in which it is not contained is tantamount to asserting that existence arises out of non-existence, or something emerges out of nothing. An effect must be of the same nature as the cause. They have the same basis. A cloth may only be made out of yarn, not out of milk. Curds may be made out of milk rather than out of yarn, etc. The theory that the effect exists before it manifests is called Satkarya Vata. Vata means theory. So his position is that the effect exists before it manifests. Now, a note on this. The Advaita Vedantas also adhere to the Satkarya Vata, with the essential difference that the transition of the cause into the effect is declared to be merely an appearance or illusion. The following explanation is given. If we saw a rope and took it for a snake, that does not mean that the rope had turned into a snake. Similarly, if Brahman created our universe, that does not mean that it actually became the universe that it created. Brahman, in this instance, cause, remains identical to itself and immutable, while the universe, in this case, effect, is merely appearance or illusion. That goes back into the concept of Maya. So, that would be their take on Kapila's premise also, the Advaita Vedantas. But continuing here, thus Samkhya asserts that there are no effects without causes. Everything in nature has a cause of its own, including body and soul, sensations and intellect, which are limited and dependent objects. So he's actually, in this breakdown, saying body and soul, sensations and intellect are limited and dependent objects. Finite. Only the cause of all causes and effects, that is Prakriti, matter, has no cause. The products are cause, while Prakriti is uncaused. The products are dependent, while Prakriti is independent. The products are many in number, limited in space and time, while Prakriti is one, all-pervading and eternal. So that's the all-pervading substratum of material, which is too fine to be sensed by the human, at least. According to the Samkhya doctrine, Prakriti consists of the three forces of Gunas: Sativa, Rajas, and Tamas. Sativa is regarded as something light and illuminating. And that's actually similar to the Sativa strain. So he calls it Sativa. Rajas, motivating and mobile. Tamas, heavy and restraining. Analysis of the Samkhya Karika shows that in effect, sativa is potential consciousness. So again, his premise is that the sativa, one of the three forces of this all-pervading nature, is potential consciousness. This is where he would incorporate that premise in order to answer the question, where does self-consciousness arise or originate? Rajas, the source of motion, action, and development. Tamas is that which restrains action and slows down development. These three gunas, constituting the basis of any object or phenomenon, are inseparably connected and mutually condition one another. They are connected as closely as flame, oil, and lamp wick. So these three forces interplay with each other. They're not necessarily independent. They have to interact and basically feed off one another. So he's not actually saying they're actually separate as such, but he's categorizing for the purpose of his philosophy. The gunas are a kind of primary principles: mass, tamas; energy, rajas; and the conscious principle, sativa. So this is the author breaking down his meaning in more modern scientific terms. So we would call sativa the conscious principle, tamas would be like mass, and rajas would be energy. Everything in nature is charged, as it were, with these three principles. The interaction between them consists in that energy cannot exist without mass, while conscious phenomena do not exist without energy. So that's a good point. The interaction between them consists in that energy cannot exist without mass, while conscious phenomena do not exist without energy. How does an object or phenomena emerge? Or how is it shaped then? The process begins with individual particles of the three forces, indifferently scattered through primary matter, being gathered together into wholes under the impact of natural affinity. This results in non-uniform pressure in various parts of matter, so that bodies distinct from one another are gradually formed instead of uniform in different matter. So, like we go into atomism, we can say the earth, air, fire, water. Some people say light instead of fire. But the similar atoms have a natural affinity for each other. So those that have that relationship or inherence combine and conjunct. And you could say in a sense that they repel other atoms that don't have this similar affinity. But that's what he's saying. This is why bodies become distinct and different from each other. It's because of their natural affinity based on the atoms. In this article, he uses the word particles. The emergence or formation of some object or phenomenon does not signify creation of matter, in the same way as the disappearance of an individual object or phenomenon does not mean destruction of matter. Again, when he talks about matter, he's talking about this all-pervading substance is supersensible. So he's saying just because we see something doesn't mean it was just created, because their whole premise is that nothing can come from nothing, or that something has to come from something. And I'll address that also. I'll do a video on idealism, because this is realism versus idealism, or materialism versus idealism. And actually, they can fold one into the other, but both are valuable studies. In the process of evolution, nature does not increase or diminish quantitatively. Now, this is a Russian Indonologist, and I'm sure a lot of the Russians question some of the science coming from, England, but I'm not sure if he agreed with the Darwinian evolution. But I'll just go with this word. We'll just say evolution, even though we're not specifically speaking. I'm sure Kapila didn't believe in evolution. These guys believe in the coexistence of levels of existence, basically. Plant, animal, human. They don't believe in linear development, basically, of life on this plane. They believe it can coexist at once. It always has. So, matter cannot be either created or destroyed. The sum total of all matter, of all its actual or potential states, always remains constant. The elements of matter are in eternal motion which cannot stop for even a second. Any material process, any growth or withering away is nothing but redistribution of matter. It's transition from the past into the present, and from the present into the future, or from potentiality to actuality. Redistribution of mass and energy engenders the entire diversity of the material world, the world of plants and animals and insects. The idea that matter, mass, and energy does not grow or diminish quantitatively, but is merely redistributed in the process of emergence and destruction of individual objects and phenomena of nature can be regarded as one of the strokes of genius of ancient Indian thinkers who anticipated later discoveries. In a most general form, this can be viewed as a distinct expression of the idea of the law of conservation of mass of substance as it is known to modern natural science. It should be stressed at the same time that anticipation as one of the forms of perception of scientific truth was characteristic of many outstanding thinkers of antiquity. As Engels put it, thinkers of the past brilliantly anticipated countless numbers of truths whose correctness is now proved scientifically. So he's going on about how a lot of these ancient guys actually preceded what they would consider scientific proof of their philosophies. So matter and the laws of evolutionary development are knowable. So again, I think he's right in the Darwinian evolution concept. I wouldn't agree with it, and the ancients wouldn't agree with it either, of course. But he's saying the ways or channels through which man receives knowledge of objects and phenomena surrounding him are the five sense organs. The entire infinite variety of matter is classified into five basic forms or essences: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Samkhya regards the process of world manifestation as ordered development of matter from the finer forms to the most dense ones, which are referred to as material elements. These essences are similar to the Greek elements, with the exception that what in Greco-Roman philosophy is referred to as a fifth essence is called the first essence or spatiality, akasa, in Samkhya. So there's just a nuance in that between the Greco-Roman philosophy, because akasa, I think we say akasha too nowadays, but that would be similar to sound. Actually, sound would be the correspondence to that concept of akasa. Subtle element of sound is all pervading. So we do not set ourselves the task of considering the interconnections and mutual relations between the gunas and essence, although this question is of great interest both on the epistemological and ontological plane. But we should dwell, however, briefly on the relationship between the gunas and the prakriti. The point is that Samkhya is the first and probably the only philosophical school in India to make a serious attempt to formulate the philosophical concept of matter. We know that there were materialists in Europe who negated the existence of matter as being of the general, calling it an empty abstraction, and recognized matter only as the being of individual things. So he's saying the big difference is Kapila would say that matter is not only what you can see. There's a material substratum, like I keep mentioning, that is super sensible. And he's mentioning how the materialist in Europe would say, well, there's just a material that we can sense. Anything else is not material. So from this viewpoint, only individual things are genuinely material, like this house, this tree, these leaves. That which is given in direct sense perception, that is, the individual sensual objects, is indeed material. This view, however, was deficient in divorcing the singular from the general, violating as it did their dialectic unity. So again, that's the whole thing with the concept of space can only be real if there are objects in space. So if there are no objects, there's really no space. And every time we think of space, I know we think of the vacuum of space, but in realistic terms, since there is no vacuum of space, that's really just a delusive concept. But the point is to say that, well, if there were no objects, there would be no space. They have a dialectic unity. So you can't have one without the other. So philosophers of the Samkhya school were also guilty of divorcing the singular from the general. But it is very important to point out that they recognize the reality of both. In their view, matter exists in two independent forms, one general and one singular. And that was where the metaphysical gap lay. Matter of the first form, the general, is substance, the first cause of the world of objects, this all-pervading substance. In it, the gunas are in a state of equilibrium. The gunas, again, are the mass, energy, and the conscious principle. And it is therefore without qualities, which prevent man from perceiving it through the senses. It is therefore incognizable. but the incognizability results from the fineness rather than from non-existence. So we can't sense it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So matter of the second form, the singular, is an infinite number of moving objects, phenomena, and events developing in space and time. The singular is accessible to the sense organs. It is knowable. Now, a note on this would be the pradhana, of course, the prakriti, in the state of equilibrium of the gunas is just as unknowable as the Kantian thing in itself. Prakriti is knowable only in the state of non-equilibrium of the gunas. That is, what is knowable here is the dynamics of the gunas rather than pradhana. The transition from pure potentiality to actuality is cognized. So, again, we can only know it when it's not in equilibrium, when it turns into an object, or it is manifested as an object, a being, or a thing, an insect, a plant, an animal. That's how we know it. That's considered non-equilibrium. When it's in perfect equilibrium, we can't sense it. The stumbling block for the Samkhya authors was the question of the origin of consciousness. R. M. Roy believes the Purusa was created by Kapila as an explanation for the origin of consciousness. So here we go into the consciousness issue. According to Kapila, Purusa is the omniscient and extremely fine element which, as distinct from Prakriti, possesses consciousness. Prakriti is the object or matter. Purusa is the subject or consciousness. There are grounds to believe that Kapila was fearful lest his proposition of his should be given an idealistic interpretation. So these guys, they try to make sure they stay away from idealism because they don't believe that two dissimilar properties can affect one another. So they wouldn't say that basically nothing can affect something. They don't agree with that premise, that nothing can affect something. Something has to affect something. Nothing can affect nothing, if you want to imagine that, but something has to affect something. So, as distinct from Atman, said Kapila, Purusa does not create anything. It is passive, it is merely a passive witness. Only Prakriti is active, and so on. Prakriti is the subject of action, in the process of spontaneous development, and comes in contact with Purusa, and ultimately cognizes itself. Purusa is devoid of the ability for self-cognition. So he's saying as if it's just this eternal witness force of consciousness that is devoid of the ability for self-cognition. It only develops when it comes in contact with Prakriti. Then it cognizes itself. The inconsistencies and errors of the Samkhya school relative to the origin and essence of consciousness were readily exploited already in antiquity by representatives of religious orthodoxy. So basically, would they say, "Oh, you didn't answer the question. Oh, must be God. Must be Brahma told you." So in the Middle Ages, you had some people come out, and they were commentators and also followers of Kapila's doctrine. They came out and made further concessions to idealism, recognizing the existence of souls independent of matter. So even he didn't necessarily postulate this. Later on, people came along and gave concessions to the idealists. Idealists basically say all is mind, to the point where they'll say the world is just your mind. That's how it gets taken. It goes that far to say that, well, this death doesn't really exist. That's just your mind. It's like, well, that's a half truth, or it's a quarter truth, you know. Just to say, like, well, think about it. If you die, then there's no death for you, so doesn't exist. There you go. It's all the mind. So the realists, they hate that shit because they're like, well, come on. As an objective existence, it has its own reality unto itself, despite you or any individual, you know, being around. So that's what happened. Concessions to idealism and the soul concept, which always tries to creep back into the philosophical systems. The substantial soul concept. On the whole, an inconsistent position on this score gave rise to reproaches on the part of idealists for concessions to materialism, as well as on the part of materialistically minded Indian philosophers. Thus, S. Radhakrishnan criticizes Kapila for deviation from idealism. So he criticized Kapila and he says, if we admit that Samkhya view of Prakriti and its complete independence of Purusa, then it will be impossible to account for the evolution of Prakriti. We do not know how latent potentialities become fruitful without any consciousness to direct them. So he's going on the consciousness thing, of course, as well. Like, people hate if I say that atoms are conscious. That's just total nonsense to someone who has a certain concept of what consciousness means. I think we need to broaden our concept of what consciousness means, basically, because basically we're talking about, really, when people say that, what they're trying to say is, well, they're praising human awareness as being, some pinnacle. I would call it a devolution from the substratum would be a higher form of awareness. I mean, it's sort of like nature, the atoms and the material substratum is in a state of Tai Chi where it is mindless, it's just automatic action, but it is sophisticated and it has an order to it. So if you don't want to call that consciousness, I would just say it's awareness or intent. So he criticized Kapila for that. Now, I don't think Kapila meant that there was no intent behind the material substratum, or there was no form of awareness that brought fruition or manifested the forms. Clearly there is. So Ram Mohan Roy holds an opposite view of the Samkhya philosophy, indicating that its weakness lies in negating the historicity of development. Had the Samkhya philosophy asserted that at a definite stage in the development of the world, consciousness arises out of things, while quantitative changes reaching a certain phase of development become qualitative changes producing new qualities, then the whole inconsistency would have disappeared. Correctly criticizing the anti-historical metaphysical quality of Samkhya philosophy, Roy regrettably commits an error himself, comparing Kapila's materialism to that of the French philosophers of the 18th century. So then he's going back to say, well, even Roy did criticize it correctly, because basically the whole boondoggle for all philosophers is always the consciousness, self-consciousness, or they never agree on the arising of self-consciousness or how it originates. Now, I believe Kapila addressed that in his material substratum, the sativa principle, the conscious principle, but he didn't necessarily satisfy a linear mind to the extent because they would say, well, where does human intelligence come from? He would say it exists in potential in the sativa principle of the material substratum, and it arises at different levels. Insects have a certain level of awareness. Plants have a certain level of awareness. They heal themselves. Insects, animals, all creatures, and then you get to humans, then you have human intelligence. So I believe he addressed that with his material substratum, his gunas being in equilibrium. But later critics are coming in to just looking for clarification. Some of it is confusing and some of it is actually exposing. But that's just another revisit of Kapila's philosophy of materialism. It's actually pretty interesting. I'll go back into Kannada also. Peace.